So I've got a panel here. I'm going to invite them to introduce themselves. Well, we're going to be talking about how to be a truly international player. We've got some experts here from a range of companies with insight into different territories. And what I think probably will be best, so that they know their companies better than anyone, if we kind of go down the line and maybe you can say who you are and maybe a few words about your company and your focus of your business.
Yeah. Definitely. Is this on? Yeah.
Yeah.
So my name is Jeppe, and I work as VP Publishing at Joypack. It's a new mobile startup that's focusing on publishing games in China and the APAC region in general. So my focus is on finding Western developers that wants to get their games published in China.
Great.
Hi. Yeah, this works as well. So I'm Ioana. I'm the CEO of Game Analytics. We are, a game analytics company specialized in mobile. We work with about 50,000 game developers. We track almost 1 billion players all over the world now. So we kind of have great insight into what works and what doesn't all over the world. So we're here to share that.
Great.
Hey, my name's Justin. I'm from Engage. We're a Japanese advertising agency that specializes in helping foreign games market in Japan. So we do everything from performance marketing, user acquisition, obviously, PR, influencer marketing, and then a little bit of creative production and services as well.
Cool. Hi guys, I'm Sean. I'm the head of supply at Mintegral. Mintegral focuses on helping Western app developers grow their revenue, their ad revenue in the APAC region, primarily in China. We do this through our own ecosystem that we built over the 5 years we've been around in the market. That's what we do.
Great. Well, why don't we start by kind of identifying where some of the opportunities are? Where are the big international opportunities right now? Is it too simplistic to say China? What should we say? Let's start with you. We spoke about China. Your introduction there. Where are the opportunities?
Well, of course, China is a big, significant part of it, being the largest gaming market in the world. But I think in general, if you look at the APAC region, countries like Indonesia, for example, Japan, obviously, Korea, India is definitely an emerging market as well, and that's just looking at the Asian region.
Yeah, interesting. Do you want to take that question as well?
Yeah, I do. So I guess the reason China is interesting that we've seen in the industry is in the past 2 years, eCPMs in advertising have risen sharply. So it used to be that you got like $5, $10 eCPM, and now you get like solid tier 1, $30 eCPM in China for good games. So because of that, after the US, it's now the biggest market for some of our developers in terms of revenue. And they are trying to grow that actively to grow their traffic over there, because most of them are now realizing like, man, there's like real money here, and my game needs to be further optimized to cater to that audience. So yeah, I'd say it's definitely an interesting market. Obviously, with China rising, other markets in the same region are going up as well, right? So the whole region is now going through a process of growth. It's not the only one, but it's the only one where we've seen this level of accelerated growth in terms of eCPMs and interest.
Okay, that's great. I'll tell you what, I'll come back to talk about Japan in a minute, if I might say. But Mintegral are part of a Chinese company, right? So again, yeah, on that, one of the things that I thought was interesting earlier on in one of our earlier talks was that there are more mobile gamers in China than there are people in the USA, right? That's so. Do you want to talk? Yeah, is it China from your perspective, obviously as well? But what's your insight into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's several elements to answer that question. I think China is definitely the main topic. I think over the course of 8 years or 6 years, I think it's grown from like 80 million to 100 million gamers to what it is now, which is just shy of 600 million mobile gamers in that market alone. And if you kind of take that away from 85% being Android and 15% being iOS, there's still millions of iOS gamers, right? They're still quite accessible to iOS developers. But obviously, it's not just about the APAC market, but it's also different products and different creative formats that we're looking at as well. So yes, the APAC market is a really big market. but also people are doing a lot more for better targeting. You may have heard the expression in-app header bidding that could be flying around every now and again, and also more creative formats. I think formats are very key for app developers to increase their yield and also increase their retention for games as well. So much more like playable ads, interactive end cards, the AR video, maybe a 3D video, for example. People such as Integral identified that this is a big problem in a way, that there's not much creative element being involved in advertising so far. So we're looking to change that.
Interesting. Let's talk about Japan for a moment as well, because that's kind of an interesting case all by itself, right? So what's your experience of the...
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I'm going to say Japan's a really interesting place, but that's because we specialize in Japan. But seriously, if you look at the top 10 grossing games in Japan, they haven't really changed the domestic ones, right? It's still going to be your Monster Strike, Puzzle Dragons, for example. But the ones that have entered into that top 10 grossing are all foreign, right? You have NetEase, Knives Out, that came out, or of course Pokemon Go with Japanese IP, but it's still not a Japanese game. So what we've seen is there's actually a lot of opportunity for foreign developers to fulfill a need in Japan. Japanese studios are really risk averse. They aren't really making new kinds of games. They either stick to the old tried and true, or just stick with their existing games that they already have out. So there's an opportunity for foreign games to fulfill this need. You see like hidden object games, like the Mytona or G5, those premium hidden object games that are killing it in Japan. They're doing great, and they're fulfilling a need that Japanese studios just didn't think about.
I will come back and talk about how to market to the Japanese audience in a minute. But actually, I just wanted to say, if I understand right, your company has an office in India as well, right? We saw. Is that correct? Did you?
For us, yes, that's correct.
Yeah, we just had a talk immediately before this about the Indian market. Is there any insight there as well? I mean, it's a very populous nation. Is that also of interest to people developing games?
It's quite different, right? So yes, very populous nation. Market is also very fragmented, but in terms of free to play, it's not. I don't see it kind of the growth happening at the same rate or at the same speed. Definitely an interesting market to follow up on. Like maybe 2 years from now, it will be the next China. But right now, advertising values are still low. So if I were to kind of advise on where to go from with a successful Western game, I would probably advise China, Japan before India. Because the effort of marketing is still pretty high, but the returns are now lower. It may be that a market like Indonesia actually probably may have better returns because players tend to be, to behave more like players in the West for some reason.
Right. Actually, one of the things that that I wanted to speak about was how the fact that the Chinese market that we saw just there as a great opportunity is kind of notoriously difficult to enter, maybe for companies in the West. Traditionally hasn't had Google Play and is dominated by the network providers, not to mention the fact at the moment that it's quite hard to get certified to game release. So how do people overcome those challenges? Maybe let's start at this end and work back. So what are the challenges of getting into China, and how do you tackle that?
Good question. I think with the big freeze at the moment, where app developers find it extremely hard to publish a game in China. I mean, this is not only just for Western app developers, but also for the guys like Tencent and NetEase, for example. I think everyone's feeling the pinch there. I think what we need to understand when you kind of launch a game out there is what kind of return on investment you're looking to get when you release a game on third-party app platforms, because all the money that you're spending, all the time that you're taking to actually localize the game and make sure that it's fitted for the markets, you need to know if you're going to get a good return on that. So you do need to work with the right people as well, right? So the right publishing partners in China, India, Japan, wherever it may be. These are the experts. So you need to kind of learn from them, find out exactly what they've done in that market, and take their advice on board, and then you need to kind of launch it there. That's what I would do anyway.
And do you concur down here as well, is getting into China?
Yeah, I think from a developer perspective, it's also a matter of finding out what is your strategy going to be in China, right? There's multiple ways to go about it. Essentially, it can be anything from working very closely with a partner in China, or you can say, I think a lot of developers right now are looking to essentially just sell their game to China, not really care what they want to do with it there. But I think it's more about finding a partner that's willing to put in the commitment to do the localization, to do the culturalization, the graphical changes that are needed, and that understands and has the relationships with the different channels there. Yeah.
Right. And Iona, would you agree with that? Is there anything to add on the challenges of China?
Well, we work with many indies, right? And I think it's clear to me that these studios do not have the capability of launching a game in China. The regulatory environment is very difficult to navigate. You literally have, if you want to go Android, you have to literally integrate like 20 different SDKs. The tooling, a lot of the tooling is very specialized. There's no proper documentation. You're going to make a little bit of money from each. So if you only do part of them, it's probably not going to be worth the effort. So really, if you can give it to somebody and they take care of it for you and they do it, I definitely recommend to go that route. For a studio that is like 10, 20, 30 people, it's not worth doing it otherwise. A lot of studios self-publish on iOS and then go with a partner for Android or H5, but and that can be worth it, but usually if you want to have like a trusted relationship, I would say just trust the partner to do your localization, do your creative adaptation so you have a consistent experience. And also be willing to wait and test it out. Like if you just give it to somebody who will not give you transparency and who'll say, oh, we'll take it and you don't have to worry, you probably do have to worry. Like those words should ring alarm bells to be like, these people, I have no idea what these people are going to do with my game. Money doesn't come easy, right, generally. So you should be willing to put in the effort to unlock this market because it is bigger and more worthwhile than probably any other market at this point.
Right. Absolutely. Before we move on to talk a little bit more about that, Justin, is Japan similarly difficult to launch a game in? I imagine there are localization issues, but just in terms of red tape, is it?
So no, there's obviously, so Japan, you can publish iOS and Google Play without a problem. There's issues about the localization, or sometimes you think about culturalizing some of your assets. Japan is a difficult market as well, but yeah, nowhere near the headache that. Nowhere near the difficulty that China is.
Oh, so on that note, then, can we sort of identify? Then, just talking about games for a little bit, some kind of international trends. Not all markets respond to the same games. There are some things that are popular at the moment. Battle Royale is a huge genre. But is that true everywhere? What are kind of popular in different territories? Let's run down the line and see if we've got some insight there.
I mean, the obvious one for China specifically is, of course, they're known as a competitive market. So competitive multiplayer traditionally does really well. Strategy games, simulation games traditionally does really well. But I view China and a lot of other countries in APAC as countries that actually consume a lot of different game genres. They're very interested in Western games now. They are very interested in games that look and feel different from what they typically see. So in my opinion, those markets are big enough to sustain that, and they are starting to have a more global sense as well. So that would be the obvious one for China, at least. For Japan, I know it's much more about the cooperative gameplay, whereas China is competitive.
Right. So your kind of advice there was you don't necessarily have to create a Chinese-style MOBA or something in order to have a successful game in China. You could do that with a...
As a Western developer, I would actually recommend against it. I would say stick to what you know. And what I see right now is that casual games, which is something that the West specializes in quite a bit, is starting to get a lot more traction in China as well. So don't try and copy what it is that they do, but just learn from your partner there instead. What can we do from a culturalization aspect? Work in local IPs or meta systems that work well in the market, but don't try and do the same. I mean, be a Western developer.
Iona, does the data that your company processes bear that out? Is there, are you identifying different trends in different territories for game types?
Yeah, so we did some genre analysis right at the beginning of this year, right? And we found that the the top 5 is very, very similar across genres. It's like action, adventure, casual games. So I don't think there's any difference there. Obviously, there is this kind of preference for MMO games, but I agree with what Jeppe said. If I was gonna start launch a game and launch a game in China, I would go with a simple title first, because if you want to localize something like either like a AAA type of experience, right, with like characters and complex mechanics, complex economy, it's gonna take forever, and you may have to tweak it for years before you get it right. With a casual game, you literally can find out in like 3 months. We found this interesting trend where players in China churn through many games during the week and come back to certain games on the weekend.
Oh, okay.
So if you manage, and there's like a stark difference, like during the week, the retention is almost half of what it is for Western games, and at the weekend it spikes. So if you can be one of the games that people come back to you on a weekend, you can make, again, good money. But then you have to put in the effort to test and become one of those games. And I think this is why we see the magic kind of quality of the Chinese market, where people are like, our game works, we don't know why. Our game doesn't work, we don't know why. So I think it's because people don't realize that just the time that people put in during the week versus weekend is different, and they need to make sure they become one of their favorite games, which may take more work.
And that's that kind of thing where people kind of graze on certain games, but other games are their hobbies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
is it? Oh, sorry. You.
Just to finish. Yeah, sorry. But I wanted to say the fewer variables you have to work with, like the simpler the game, the easier you can fine tune them. So obviously, hyper casual are much easier to go with.
Yeah. And also the simplistic visuals of games like that translate more easily rather than. What about Japan? Is that what kind of games do particularly well over there? And is it different from the rest of the world?
Japan is a little bit different in a lot of ways. You look at the top charts in Japan, and you see Japanese RPGs, JRPGs do really well. Less of an emphasis on that, like as Jeppe said, about competitive play. There's more cooperative. And then also match 3 or casual games do well. But the ones that are doing most of the time that do the best have some sort of RPG element involved. So that casual plus a deep meta game, something that does really well in Japan. But as Jeppe said, don't try to do something that's not to your strength as a studio. Don't try to make a game. I would highly recommend against making a game for a Japanese consumer, unless you grew up in the culture and everything else. It's better to make your game that you're good at, and then trying to introduce that game, whether it's a different genre or different characters or whatever, to the Japanese market and be successful that way. And you'll have more success.
Sean, when we spoke a little bit earlier on about approaching a Chinese publisher to take a game, or like having a partner in China. What kind of thing are Chinese companies looking for from Western developers?
Yeah, so we look for 2 things. So we look for the developers that are keen to learn about the Eastern market. I think, as the China market and as the Japanese market and Korean market and Southeast Asia kind of grows and grows and grows, I think people will become a lot more aware of this market and what the opportunity is there. So that's one type of people that we do look after. And the other type is that people that do launch games and don't know they have DAU in these markets, but don't know how to monetize it well, right. Which is a bit of it's like a waste of money for me in a way, because they could be doing so much more in these markets, but they don't know how to. So these are the guys that I'm currently working with. So I'll give you an example. The guys at let's say Tactile for the Cookie Cats game. Cookie Cats, because it's got the word cookie and cats in it, is doing absolutely amazingly well in China. But they don't know how to kind of monetize it well. They think that a simple Western solution would actually do well across the whole kind of worldwide ecosystem, where that's generally not the case. If you work with specialists within areas, then you can increase your revenue and actually make the most of the users out there.
Does anyone want to weigh in on that? No.
I mean, generally I would say that the Chinese publishers are looking for Western games that feel Western, right? And this is what we talked about earlier. Hyper casual translates really well because it's at its core, it's just good gameplay and simplistic art that's universal, right? So I think also Chinese publishers have realized that they shouldn't be scouting the West for hardcore titles that they're capable of producing themselves. They're scouting the West for casual games that feel Western, indie games, paid games. You know, these are the things that they're looking for, and it's inherently because they don't know how to produce them the same way that a Western company does.
We were talking here about being a truly international player, and you mentioned sort of indie games there. It's the big games like, you know, the sort of Tencent's game and PUBGs and so on that get the press. Is there a thriving international indie scene in all the territories where you guys all work? Is there new talent coming up through the indie scene?
I'll take that one. No, in Japan. So just generalizing a little bit, but as a general rule in Japan, you graduate college. Or okay, let's go for the U.S. You graduate, you work for AAA. It's the goal. Maybe after 10 years, you quit, start your own studio, and that's the goal. And you want to, become an indie developer, maybe create your own studio with some of your friends. In Japan, it's graduate, work for AAA, and then retire from that AAA after how many years? So, I mean, you look at the best performing indie games in Japan right now are all from the West.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And what about other territories? Is that true of China, or what's the indie scene like in other territories where you work?
I'd say that in China, well, I don't. It's hard to speak for the whole market in terms of indies, right? It's not necessarily the market where we see the most amount of indies. From my experience with it, the copycatting is very common in terms of indies. Not necessarily just coming up with creative IP and so on, but I couldn't tell you that I play like all the games in the Chinese App Store and so on. It's more what I see. I don't know if you know more about that, Sean.
Not really, no, but I'll give it a good go. So I think in the indie scene in China, I think it really does depend on what publisher you're going to work with. So it's similar to what the guys at Voodoo do, and also the developers that they publish as well. That even the developers that they work with, they're getting a good name for themselves as well, because obviously Voodoo does good work. So it potentially would be potentially the same thing in China as well. But I've not got much to add to that.
Okay, well let's talk about marketing a game. When you're launching a new game, you have to be aware of different local tastes, but there's also lots of competition. And how do you market games in diverse territories? Let's talk about Japan, because that's your primary business. But then let's also talk about the other territories too, and how you bring a game to market.
All right. So for the Japanese market, establishing hype and credibility is extremely important, whether domestic or foreign. And there's a couple ways to do that. Most of the top, using the grossing charts as a benchmark, top 100 are using TV ads of some sort. And it's kind of a quick cycle from a game, it advertises on TV, so people think it's popular, so then they'll download it, and then it becomes popular. It's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. It's not really that hipster, like, oh, I discovered it first. Japanese people would rather go, oh, everyone's playing that, I should play it. Generalizations, there are exceptions, but that's just kind of how the market is. So for mid-sized studios to indies that we help with, TV's sometimes, well, most of the time out of the budget reach, right? It's a pretty big investment, right? But there are ways to establish that hype and credibility. You can do PR, influencer marketing is becoming really popular now in Japan. Mm-hmm. And then, but if you haven't launched in Japan, you can also do a pre-registration campaign as well to kind of create that hype and desire to play it. It hasn't been launched yet, and people want what you can't have, right? So I mean, even like Pokemon Go delayed their launch in Japan and had, obviously slightly different. They have a major IP, but kind of creating that hype and credibility beforehand was really important.
And what about other territories? What's your experience of how to market a game in other territories? What do we know about China, for instance? Is it the same kind of activities that work over there?
So some of the ad formats are different, definitely. Like we saw, for instance, that what works in China is banner ads. Which apparently works really well. And compared to other territories, I'd say right now it's becoming quite competitive to attract an audience, especially for iOS audiences, because it is a more centralized platform. So obviously people tend to go iOS first. That has left an opening for kind of, I guess, Android games, but on the Android side, you do have to compete. Like you're dependent on the channel partner a lot. They have their own tools. So if you do want to get people in the channel, you have to be ready to work with a channel. So again, a good partner is priceless. And the other interesting thing that we see is now H5 games, right? HTML5. Apparently, there are like 300 million users now, gaming players on WeChat. So getting those players in itself is a challenge. It's not my domain of expertise, but right now we see people going iOS and then HTML5 instead of iOS and Android, just because it's somewhat cheaper to get those players, but you can engage them and you can retain them and you can make revenues off them at very high scale. So I would suggest definitely going for those platforms.
And Jeppe, is that the same from you? How did Joypack promote games?
Yeah, I'd say generally when you look at China, the same marketing trends that you see in the rest of the world rings true, but it's just with added complexity because, for example, social media marketing is a lot more difficult. There's a lot of different channels that you're not used to from a Western perspective. So whereas we use Facebook in the West, you have a lot of different opportunities, WeChat, QQ, they have their own versions of everything in terms of that. But other than that, the basic practices from the West rings true. Follow. There are specific times a year where it's really beneficial to do marketing campaigns. Where you see, in relation to Chinese New Year, for example, you will see Chinese players play much more, right? So that's a good opportunity for marketing your game. And then obviously local IPs is very, very important. Bringing that in, and that's why, as Joanna mentioned, you need that local partner.
Right. We're doing okay for time. I think we started a little bit late as well. But before I carry on with some of my questions, I don't want to miss an opportunity to take any from the audience. So, does anyone have a question for the panel? No. It's okay. If you do, put your hand up, but we'll crack on, and then my colleague we can run you over a mic if anyone has anything to say. So let's talk a little bit about what it's like working for an international company. The topic of the panel here is how to be a truly international player, and all four of you work for companies that have interests all over the world. Sean, maybe you can start. You work for obviously you're a Brit, I think, Mintegral is a Chinese company. So what are the challenges of working for an international company that branches east to west?
I think there's a lot more pros and cons. I would say the pros of kind of working for a truly international company such as Mintegral is the fact that you get to work in a completely different culture than what you're not used to. So prior to this, I was working for a UK-based company called Super Awesome, very UK, ventured out in the US, and then we had a joint venture in Southeast Asia, which was absolutely fantastic because you get to understand how they actually work, but which they work very closely in the same kind of way as what the West would anyway. But obviously when I joined with Mintegral, you get to know exactly how they work, what's their mentality, what the products are currently going on right there as well. I would say, the time difference plays a massive part, but, just like any kind of global company, you compromise in terms of, starting the day early or finish later, how urgent you need to be, but you need to understand the culture as well. So you need to understand exactly how each market works. Different holiday days obviously may vary, like Chinese New Year, it's not on the 31st of December, it's on the end of February, so you need to kind of bear this in mind when obviously communicating with different colleagues who are based in different markets.
Yeah. The rest of you, is that your experience as well? What is it like working for a company that works in different time zones and has different objectives around different departments around the world? Yeah.
I'm going to agree with Sean. It's the basic practicalities, just being in different time zones, different cultural habits, different vacation structures. But I think, it's much more interesting, basically. I'm from Denmark, right? So it's a fun combination to be able to talk with people who has a completely different mindset in terms of gaming. I think that exchange is priceless, something that I wouldn't be without. So from that sense, it's very rewarding, even if it's a practicality hassle, you know.
Yeah. And the same for you both, I guess. You know,
Yeah, I want to say, obviously nobody wants to say anything bad about their boss or their investors, right?
Sure.
So, but the truth is there are differences. On one hand, I think people who don't have a Chinese investor or owner or whatever will definitely have one at some point. Like, it's just maybe, I live in London and it's like half owned by Chinese companies, the whole city. So, it does happen, right? If companies are hungry and they're investing and they're coming out and doing deals. So definitely, I think just people should get used to the fact that this will be now part of life and normal. The other thing is work culture in China is very different. So when you do work with Chinese companies, you will get messages on the weekend. Right. Like that will just happen. Actually at some point, the time difference will work in your favor because they will eventually have to go to sleep. Otherwise, you would get messages at 10 p.m., right? It doesn't mean people are unreasonable. They get it that you have a personal life. Actually, they're quite good. They don't necessarily expect you to work the same hours as them, but you will get messages. You will see them, you know, that they go really hard, you know, so you will feel like obviously you need to keep up. So there's definitely that feeling, which you need to be prepared for. This being said, it's a very trust-based culture. So once you develop trust, you feel like you're in the circle, right? Like you can much more easily get things done. They want to move fast. They want to give you things. They want to support you. So it's very much, it does feel like once you're in the family does everything they can to push you forward and advance you. So that's why it is completely worth it. And they do move fast, and there's a lot for us as Westerners, I think, we were used to be like, you know, rule the world. I think that competition is very welcome and learning to do things in a new way. So yeah, it's not always easy, but it's interesting, competitive, and I think it's very worth it.
And is your experience from working with Japan and the West similar?
Yeah, so we're Engage is based in California, but we have a parent company in Japan who uses their Japanese team. And the only thing, I mean, time zones, pain, like those are all, you know, pretty standard, I think, across the industry. The only thing I would mention is for Japanese companies, just not even our company, but partner companies, face-to-face meetings and interactions is a lot more important than it is in the West. You know, we're much more used to Slack or whatever, but in Japan, you know, our parent company's our team actually goes and visits some of our domestic Japanese clients and partners, because even if, you know, it could be sent in an email, having that face-to-face meeting is still important. It's a part of the tradition and it's important for the culture.
Actually, so on that note, meeting people in person, it's very interesting that has cultural significance. I think it's actually just a good thing to do from a business perspective anyway. What are the international events that people should go to in order to learn more about the market? Obviously, Pocket Gamer Connects, if you're in the West. But what about in the East? Where should people, I mean, Tokyo Game Show's coming up, right?
Game Show's next week. Is that already next week? Or in 2 weeks?
It's very soon, isn't it?
Yeah, 2 weeks. Yeah, it's the biggest one in Japan. It's like E3, but I mean, it has there's definitely a consumer focus as well, but you know, in terms of business and meeting with all the major Japanese companies, yeah, Tokyo Game Show for sure.
What about the Chinese market? Where should people be taking their...
I definitely recommend China, Joy, if you can stand the heat of Shanghai in the summer. It's a huge experience. A lot of very interesting companies attend. There's a big consumer part as well, but it's business oriented. And there is so much interest from Chinese companies right now in the West that it's definitely recommended to go.
So Finnish developers, British developers, they'd have a great time over there. It would be a very useful thing for them.
Yeah, I think most developers will find it very easy to find meetings that are relevant for them. So yeah, that's a big recommendation from here at least.
Great. Is that also your experience too? You know, do you have any other events in mind that you think people should go to?
There's definitely G-Star in
thank you.
Korea.
Yeah, sure.
So that as well. I know our team loves that. There's the one in India as well. That's in November. I'm trying to remember. They changed the name this year. It's NASCOM something. Yeah, there's also a conference.
Oh, that's right. No, it just changed its name, didn't it? It was NASCAR, I think, but NASCAR, but it's changed itself to.
So I think that one is also a very good one. Sorry, didn't want to steal your thunder on the G-Star thing.
No. Thunder not stolen. thunder happening right now.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more kind of APAC-focused companies coming over to Europe because I understand this as well. So, for example, Mintegral coming here to Pocket Gamer,
Yeah, of course.
and also some other I won't mention because they will hit me. But in terms of other conferences around Europe, they generally do attend because they know that the European market is huge for them. So rather than you coming to China Joy or Tokyo or one in Korea as well or India, then they'll come to you, such as what we're doing now, and then it makes it easier for us to kind of communicate.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I think we probably got sort of a little over 5 minutes left. I'm not quite sure. That's flashing, I think. So that's we started a little bit late, so we're not gonna be in a rush to close. But we should probably just see if there's any. Okay. Yeah, that's thank you. So we've got the Petra Kutcher in here next, but we're okay for a few minutes. We started late. So are there any questions from the audience? We've got some experts here in how to take your game international. If anyone here would like to ask a question, we'll throw you a mic. Are you standing up to ask a question, Chris? No, okay. I can carry on, but if anyone has anything they want to ask about taking their game elsewhere in the world, this is probably a good opportunity. If not, I should say these folks are here for both days. Look them up on the meeting system. It's, they're ready to meet and discuss. So in that case, let's in the final few minutes we have, let's kind of go around here. We'll start with you, Jeppe, and say, finally, if you had just one piece of advice for a small company, maybe someone here who wants to look outside Europe and take their game, what's the first thing they should do? Where should they start?
They should start by attending the conferences that are relevant in the country that they want to move their game to. I think that's step one. Just researching what is out there, finding that partner, I think is key. And I also think it's a good idea to look carefully at your game and then understand what is it that it does well and what is it that it definitely doesn't do well, and then find a partner that suits that. Yeah.
Cool, great. Iona?
Yeah, I'd say obviously everybody still wants to publish successful games. So if your game is not working in the West, nobody will want to publish it in the East. So it is what it is, right? So get it working first. And if you have a promising prototype, yes, you can get it over. You can do like a global launch at the same time. That's perfectly fine. But you need to have some numbers to show that the game is doing great. And still, people look at retention, day 1, day 7, day 14. Day 7 for China, like I said, is super important because of that weekend trend. So you want to watch that one particularly carefully. But yeah, grow your retention numbers, grow your day 7 retention, and when you hit like good numbers, when you pass like 15% in day 7 retention, you can go to either a global publisher or a publisher that specializes in APAC, and you're pretty much good to go. They'll be able to give you feedback on how to localize and all that from there.
That's fantastic, thank you. Justin, yeah, sure.
So Japan's a little tougher. Well, Japan's tough to get a publisher, just like anywhere. An alternative route, one piece of advice I would have is self-publishing is an option. Localization is relatively inexpensive, and most of the time your strength as a game is going to be the fact that it is coming from the West. And it's something different and unique. So as long as you have that high-quality localization, then you can look at doing some test budgets either on your own or with a partner, right? Facebook is relatively easy. UAC is pretty easy to run on your own. And then after that point, you can look with partners to try to scale that, whether you're doing ASO or some other paid campaign.
Great, thank you. And yeah, Sean, one last piece of advice.
I think knowledge is key. I think before kind of reaching out, but if your game was successful and if you've been to the conferences and if you've kind of done all that and you've got a good solution, then I think you need to understand how each market works from the experts that do work in their markets. Understand exactly what is trending out there, what's the current market, how does it currently look, are there current similar games in these markets that are similar to yours, and how well are they doing? Are they doing well in terms of revenue, retention, in-app purchasing? I'll probably gather all this information, and this information is not only just from us, also from Jeppe at Joypack, from Game Analytics, from Engage, for example. These guys are the experts within what we do, so speak to them, get advice, make sure you do all your research, and then soft launch potentially in a similar market to see how it goes.
Wonderful. Look, thank you very much. I think we're reaching the end of the day there. So I'm just going to thank my panel, which I think were fantastic. So Jeppe from Joypack, Iona from Game Analytics, Justin from Engage, and Sean from Mintegral. So thanks for a round of applause for them and their insight. Thanks, folks.